In our previous lessons, we have learnt about the various causes that led to the outbreak of the American Civil War. We were also introduced to Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln became the 16th President of the United States of America in the year 1860, and he was strongly anti-slavery. It is this stance that had threatened the southern states after Lincoln became the President of the US. In this lesson, we will talk about how those reasons finally led to the outbreak of the American Civil War, and we will also pinpoint the moment when this American Civil War finally broke out. So now let us begin our discussion on the outbreak of the American Civil War. In our previous lessons, we learned that the 7+4 southern states had seceded from the Union. Now when the southern states seceded from the Union, they together now made up the Confederate States of America. And they proclaimed themselves as the Confederate States of America in 1861. That is, it happened soon after Abraham Lincoln came to the office as the President of the United States of America. To give themselves an independent identity, an autonomous life, this Confederate States of America now went on to having a Confederate flag. So they had given themselves independence from the Union and now had their own Confederate flag. Along with this, they also drafted a new Confederate Constitution. This Confederate Constitution was very different from the US Constitution. So in every possible way, the Confederate States had broken away from the Union. And finally, and most importantly, they also had their own president. It was Jefferson Davis, who now became the President of the Confederate States of America in the year 1861, and in this way the southern states had completely divided themselves or separated themselves from the Union government. When Abraham Lincoln came to power, he saw that his country was divided into two factions or two groups of states. On the one hand, he had the northern states who were favoring the rule of Abraham Lincoln. And on the other hand were the southern states who had seceded from the Union and had went on to forming the Confederate States of America. Now when Abraham Lincoln came to power, he saw that this Confederate States of America threatened the unity of the USA as a nation, which is why he declared the secession unconstitutional. He said that this secession was illegal and it was unconstitutional because the Constitution did not grant the independence of the Confederate States of America, which we can also call as the CSA. The CSA was not an independent nation, which is why it was declared, or which is why the secession was declared unconstitutional and illegal. Now Abraham Lincoln tried his best to preserve the Union at any cost. That is to say, he wanted to keep the northern and the southern states together so that the United States of America remained a united nation. But he saw this plan was not possible because the Confederate States of America had already been formed by the time he came to power as the President of the US. Now let us find out what the CSA was doing against the United States of America. Since Lincoln was not able to bring the CSA or the Confederate States together into the Union, he now declared it unconstitutional. And since this was unconstitutional and threatened the unity of the nation, he also resorted to use military forces. He said that he would now fall back on or use military forces to bring these rebellious Confederate states into the Union. And in this way, he tried to resist the separation of the southern states. The southern states that had already begun seceding, the first 7 southern states, when they had seceded, 4 more southern states were also inspired by them, and together 11 states were now on the verge of joining the Confederate States of America. And Lincoln saw that the CSA or the Confederate States together threatened the United States. because the United States was now broken into two halves. It was no longer an independent and a united nation as it formerly was, which is why he now said that he would now resort to using military forces to bring everything together. But was Lincoln able to use military forces to bring the southern states under his control into the Union? Let us now find this out. The southern states had no intention of coming back to the Union. This is because they had already declared their independence. They now had their Confederate flag, they had their Confederate constitution, and they also had their own president. So they now considered themselves completely independent, though the United States did not give them the independence or did not give them a constitutional status. Now the Confederate Congress, yes, you heard it right, the Confederate States went on to having their own legislature, which was called the Confederate Congress, and this Confederate Congress now created a volunteer army. This volunteer army was created for defending the southern states that comprised the Confederate States. Now who joined this volunteer army? This volunteer army came to be known as the Confederate Army, and young stars from the southern states joined in masses this Confederate Army. Along with that, many people who left the US Army also joined the Confederate Army, and in this way the Confederate States were strengthening themselves. They made their own volunteer army, which came to be known as the Confederate Army. Now you must be wondering why they made up this Confederate Army. This was done in order to establish their military power, because they knew that to secede from the Union successfully, they also had to use force. Abraham Lincoln had already said that he would use force to bring these Confederate States under his control. Now in order to defeat and defend themselves from the Union force, the Confederate States formed their own Confederate Army. In this image on your right, you can see the Confederate Army. They even went on to having their own uniform that was distinctly different from the navy blue uniform of the US Army, and in this way they were trying to establish their complete independence. They were trying to establish how different they were from the Union forces, from the US government, and in fact from the US Army as well. And in this way the Confederate States now had their own army. Now let us find out what this army did, or how the Confederate States were now rebelling against the Union States. We just learned that the Confederate States went on to forming their own volunteer army, which came to be known as the Confederate Army. Now this Confederate Army had a very important task of defending the Confederate States and simultaneously overthrowing the Union forces. Now when Lincoln declared that military force could be used on the Confederate States, the US troops or the US Army were stationed in the southern states, and the US Army were waiting to attack the Confederate States and bring them under their own control. And similarly, the US Army or the US troops were also stationed in a place called Fort Sumter. This Fort Sumter will be very important in our discussion, and we will now find out why it was very important in the context of the outbreak of the American Civil War. In the Fort Sumter that was located in the southern state of South Carolina, something very important happened. Now South Carolina was not just a Confederate state, but in fact it was the first state to secede from the Union. So in the April of 1861, the Confederate forces or the Confederate Army now attacked the Federal troops that were stationed at Fort Sumter. Now what happened in this Fort Sumter? In this Fort Sumter, the Federal forces or the US military troops were surrounded by the Confederate troops from all sides. And what followed was a full-fledged Battle of Fort Sumter. So this Battle of Fort Sumter took place in April 1861. What happened in this battle? As in, who emerged victorious? The battle went on for 2 long days, and after 2 days, the Federal forces finally had to surrender and give up the charge of Fort Sumter to the Confederate forces. So, it was the Confederate forces that managed to defeat the Federal forces in this Battle of Fort Sumter. Now, this Battle of Fort Sumter finally marks the outbreak of the American Civil War. Conflict, that is full military conflict, broke out between the Confederate forces and the Federal forces. And this was the first battle that was waged between these two forces under the American Civil War. Now let me ask you a very important question. When did the American Civil War begin? Was it in 1859, 1860 or 1861 or 1862? Yes, you are right. The American Civil War began in the year 1861 between the Confederate forces on the one hand and the Federal forces on the other hand. We learnt that the Federal forces were attacked and defeated by the Confederate forces in that Battle of Fort Sumter. And this marks the formal outbreak of the American Civil War in the year 1861. When Lincoln saw that the Federal troops or the US military troops were defeated, he now called for volunteers. Volunteers were called from the various northern states to suppress the rebellion. And soon enough, masses of volunteers, that is masses of youngsters, joined the cause of Abraham Lincoln. This is because these masses wanted to fight for the unity of their nation. They did not want their nation to be divided into two halves between the northern states and the southern states, that is between the Federal forces and the Confederate forces, which is why they now tried their best to suppress the rebellion. Now we have learnt that before the American Civil War broke out, 7 states had already seceded from the Union and 4 states were following their lead. After the Battle of Fort Sumter in 1861, following which Lincoln called for volunteers to suppress the rebellion, the 4 states that were formerly threatening to secede from the Union, the 4 states as in Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee and North Carolina, now finally seceded from the Union. So it were finally 11 states under the Confederate States of America that were against the 20 northern states which were in the side of the Federal forces. Now this is how the American Civil War broke out, and after the Battle of Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for volunteers, these 4 states now finally seceded from the Union. With the outbreak of the American Civil War in the year 1861, the political map of America also underwent a drastic change. The political landscape was very different because now America was divided into separate sets of states. The areas that are marked in blue in the map show you the Union states. These northern states were in the side of the Federal forces, that is they wanted the unity of the nation, which is why they had joined hands with the Federal forces and together they made up the Union states. Following which came the Confederate states. The southern states together made up the Confederate states. These Confederate states were the ones who wanted the continuance of slavery, who thrived on using slave labor. So the Confederate states were the ones that were lying in the southern parts of the country. Following which were the Confederate states that joined afterwards. That is the 4 states that were initially threatening to secede from the Union, that is after the Battle of Sumter in 1861 and the American Civil War breaking out. After this, they joined the Confederate States and together these 11 states made up the Confederate States of America. Now you must be wondering, what do these states in yellow show you? These areas marked in yellow show you the neutral border states. These neutral border states did not join the Union forces or the Confederate forces. These states were 5 in number. Now these states were also important because often battles were fought over these states. So the Union states on the one hand were fighting against the Confederate states on the other hand, and this marks the American Civil War. Now you should keep in mind that the American Civil War was not between two different countries. The Confederate States of America was in no way an independent nation. It was not an independent country. The United States of America had simply been divided into two groups. So this was a civil war that was happening amongst people who lived in the same country. The Union forces or the northern states were in the side of the government itself, which is why they made up the Union states. And the Confederate states were simply revolutionary states. They were revolting against the government, and this made up the American Civil War. This is a point that you should definitely keep in mind, that USA and CSA were not two different countries. USA was the country and within which were fighting the Union states and the Confederate states. As a quick recap, let us go over the details of the American Civil War once again. The American Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865, and it was fought between the Federal forces on the one hand and the Confederate forces on the other hand. Who made up the Federal forces? The 20 northern states who were anti-slavery and pro-abolition made up the Federal forces. These northern states, that is, these 20 northern states, wanted the country to be united. They did not want the country to be divided on the grounds of slavery and various other reasons, which is why they joined hand with the Federal forces, and together they now fought against the 11 southern slave states. The southern slave states, on the other hand, wanted the continuance of slavery. They were pro-slavery, because they thought that by abolishing slavery their agrarian economy will be hampered, which is why they thought that they thrived on slave labor. So these were the slave states that made up the Confederate forces. Now the federal government of the United States of America was the government of the Federal forces. The Confederate forces had illegally and unconstitutionally seceded from the Union government to together make up the Confederate forces of America. It wasn't a legal body or it wasn't an independent nation, despite which they went on to having the government of the Confederate States of America. So this group was fighting against this one. Now the Federal forces were also known as the Union, and on the other hand the Confederate forces were known as the Confederacy. So this was a war between the Union and the Confederacy. The Union comprised of the Federal forces itself, which is why their flag was the flag of the United States of America. And on the other hand, the Confederate forces had proclaimed themselves as Confederate States of America, and they went on to having their own Confederate flag, which was different from the flag of the United States of America. So this in a gist explains to you what the American Civil War was. With this we come to an end of our discussion on the outbreak of the American Civil War. We learnt the various reasons, the focal point of which was the issue of slavery that contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War. The Civil War divided the independent United States of America into two groups, that is, into the northern states on the one hand and the southern states on the other hand. The northern states together with the Federal forces made up the Union, and the southern states made up the Confederacy. The northern states were pro-abolition and anti-slavery, and the southern states on the other hand wanted to reinforce and strengthen the practice of slavery. This explains to us what the American Civil War was. In our subsequent lesson, we will understand the various important events that happened during the American Civil War, and that would eventually take us to the end of this chapter on the American Civil War. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.